The theme of this conference this year is balancing the joint force for future security challenges. Tell me about the genesis of that theme and about this year's effort.
Well, thanks for the question, because I think it's incredibly important to lay out exactly why at the Army War College we're talking about balancing the joint force going forward. I think probably the biggest question coming out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the decade plus of war in general is this idea that where do we go now? There's an uncertainty about the future environment, which there generally always is uncertainty. And there are some fairly sizable questions on the horizon with respect to potential threats to U.S. national security that have a defense relevant component to them. And so there will be really over the next 5 to 7 years a sort of a pitched battle amongst those that look at the environment and those that craft reactions or responses to that environment that will play out. And we hope with this conference that we can actually contribute to that debate by basically taking on some of the big questions. We have a rising challenge in the Western Pacific and Northeastern Asia. We have a continuing challenge with North Korea. We are concerned about the nuclear program in Iran, and on top of that, we appear to have a Middle East that in many respects is melting down. The authority structures in many of the more important Middle Eastern states appear to be at least under pressure, if not melting down, in places like Syria, Iraq. And then we have what I think is a general sort of wish that the rest of the world will be okay. So I think it's going to be really important in this conference to basically say, okay, what does the world look like? What are the most important challenges and opportunities from a defense perspective in the world? And as a result of that, how should we structure the force post-Iraq and Afghanistan to contend with that world and to sort of absorb the challenges that are likely to, that we are likely to encounter over the next forthcoming decade?
What are some of the key, for example, what are some of the key alternatives you think will be discussed and debated?
Well, let's just go chronologically, I think, which is the best way to do it. I mean, we're going to open the panel with an examination of the environment. And we call it the decision-making environment on purpose because we're not just specifically talking about the classic assessment of the strategic environment as we all sort of have been trained to look at. We're also looking at the internal decision-making environment inside the United States. For example, we clearly have declining resources in the Defense Department, or at least we're facing an era where at a minimum the resources are going to be flat, but likely declining. The force is going to get smaller. Certain areas are going to get more emphasis than others. Unmanned systems, space, cyberspace, anti-access area denial, long-range precision strike. These are all areas that are sort of, their stock is rising. And so I think we're going to first take a look at that environment and just identify the basic contours of that environment, both the external challenges we're likely to face from a military perspective and the internal challenges we're likely to confront that are sort of the political constraints that are associated with the end of the wars and the cost of the wars and looking backward. The desire to sort of engage in the world in a different way than we have over the last decade plus with military operations. Obviously the change in the amount we have in our checking account, things like that, the internal decision-making dynamics. We'll look at those and that'll identify what I think are the basic contours of how defense and military leaders at the senior levels of the department need to look at their choices going forward, the prism at least which through they should look at their choices. And I think we're gonna what we call the cage match, and it's this debate between PACOM and CENTCOM. For the last probably 25 years, if not longer, CENTCOM has drawn a great deal of U.S. military attention based on the events that have occurred, again, over the past quarter century in that part of the world. PACOM has really was ascendant in 2001, early 2001, when the Bush administration first came to office. It was ascendant in in the way it was identified as a security challenge. 9/11 knocked us back into the CENTCOM area of responsibility. PACOM has had from a defense sort of strategy and focus perspective, has had a bit of a hiatus until very recently with the release of the Defense Strategic Guidance in 2012, which really placed it in a position of prominence in U.S. defense strategy. What we plan on doing second in this conference is basically looking at the two regions, which have very different challenges. One, you have sort of the unfavorable order posed by a rising great power in that region where we perceive there's a potential threat. On the other hand, in the other region, in the CENTCOM AOR, you really have increasing incidents of disorder that you have to basically think through how would you contend with it if it stays it is right now, or it expands, or it affects other regions. So I think that this cage match between those two is going to be a very interesting way of looking at the two principal focus regions in the current defense, the idea of rest of the world risk. I think it's a great way to basically say, look, we have two primary regions that we focus on in U.S. defense strategy, but there's an entire world outside of those two regions, and that's affected by those two regions, and that other regions of the world affect those two primary regions. And what are the key, what are the key challenges, defense-relevant challenges that are emerging from these other regions of the world and functions, frankly, cyberspace, et cetera, that might impact U.S. defense decision-making through the forthcoming. Really, when you're in a period of declining resources, you have to think about excess redundancy. And so what we're looking at, redundancy is a good thing. In military parlance, redundancy really is a good thing because you sort of want some fail-safes built into your system so you don't have a single point of failure. But we're going to look at roles and missions, and we're going to look at roles and missions both in sort of the new context, which is from this idea that cyber, space are emerging as new areas that we have to sort of delineate lines of responsibility and authority. But also, again, sort of this idea that, certain capabilities are replicated across service departments, and we have to identify where maybe we might be able to find some efficiency that continues to underwrite our effectiveness that we might be able to sort of curtail or scale back. I would say an associated question with that roles and missions issue is the current global command and control structure as we see it now, codified in the Unified Command Plan, and really a product of the Second World War in many respects. Is that Unified Command Plan, is that the right structure for the 21st century going forward? Learned in the conference from the other panels, and we're going to make some choices on what are the key characteristics of the future joint force. And I'm really looking forward to that panel in particular, because really what we want to do is we want to take an honest look at this is the decision-making environment and the contours of the environment within which we have to make defense decisions, right? Here are some very specific regional and functional challenges that we need to take on. Here are kind of areas where we have overlapping capabilities and redundancy in the joint force where we might be able to get bigger bang for the buck if we scale certain things back or clearly delineate lines of responsibility in certain areas. And then finally, based on all of that, what should the future joint force look like? What should it be most ready to take on?
How does this conference and what we learned from it provide policymakers, specifically Army leaders, with value added?
Well, I think the most important question we want to get to tell you the truth, I think in the end what we want to be the great takeaway from this conference is what is the balance and therefore points of focus for the joint force, right? So there is a balance, quote unquote, balance implied by the current direction of the department that's first articulated in the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, largely reaffirmed in the Strategic Choices Management Review, and likely to be reaffirmed once more in the forthcoming Quadrennial Defense Review. At the same time, the chairman has this idea of globally integrated operations that's overlaid, or at least is the implementing sort of instrument for all of those things going forward. The idea that we're going to have to basically pool resources globally, integrate them in a global sense and be able to apply them against specific challenges, both regionally and functionally, at the time of greatest need, time and point of greatest need. What we want to do is we want to hopefully walk away from this conference with a better idea on what the balance is between the various challenges facing the Department of Defense, the capabilities at their disposal, and how we can best sort of integrate these capabilities into this idea of globally integrated operations to underwrite core U.S. interests in the future with the military instrument in concert with all the others, of course.